Hello and welcome to Sprint 55 of ManageIQ. This was a 2-week sprint, a standard sprint that we started in 2017. And I think you'll be all pleasantly surprised with the amount of stuff we got done. Next slide, please. So as usual, I'll go over the sprint statistics. Carol will give us an update on the community. Dan Clarizio will give us an update on the classic UI, Chris K on the service UI, Greg Blomquist on the providers, Greg M on Automate, Greg T on platform, Alberto on the API, and Dave on QE. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the main repo, we had 144 pull requests merged. So one of the things that I've been noticing is that this count has been drifting up in the main repo, and I've also noticed the other repos, their counts drifting up as well. I don't think we've done a comparison of pre-split and post-split. Maybe Marianne and I can do that. But I'm venturing to guess that the numbers actually might be higher than they were before the split. So out of the 144, 56 were enhancements, 30 were bugs, and the rest sprinkled around in various areas. Next slide, please. If we kind of break down the PRs by area, roughly half were in the providers, 21 were in the core, 12 in the REST API, 12 in UI-related things, 11 in services, and 10 in chargeback. Next slide, please. Okay, and here's the count by the repos that we're managing. So a total of 495 pull requests merged across all the repos, which even if we take out the integration test repo, which was never part of the main ManageIQ repo, that still gets us down to high 300s. So, and that's for 2 weeks, not for 3 weeks. We used to be doing those kind of numbers on 3-week counts. So, as I kind of anticipated, I think the splitting of the repos, while causing a little bit of a initial disruption, really allows more velocity per repository. So please expect more repo splits as we go forward. They will be coming, our way here as the weeks and sprints roll by. Next slide, please. Carol.
All right, thanks. So for the community side, as usual, we have the last week ManageIQ blog posts. Both of these by Ellen and Josh, they are both first-time authors. And they, did a really great job. Very interesting posts. So thank you. And we're always looking for authors new and returning. So contact John and let you know if you're interested to write. We have a lot of events and meetups coming up as well. Last time I mentioned FOSS Asia in Singapore and KubeCon in Berlin, which is this month. It's beginning of March. And so I'm listing a few more that I didn't mention previously. So this month we also have a meetup, like a workshop in San Diego. It's a CloudForms ManageIQ workshop. Organized, I think, by some of the solution architects in Red Hat. And then in Warsaw, Poland, there's a bar camp, and I'll be sharing like a overview about ManageIQ and maybe giving a small demo there as well. That's next month. One of our engineers, Julian Chill, he's speaking at RailsConf in Phoenix in April. That's his session, even though it's not exactly ManageIQ related, but it sounds really interesting. It's about chatbots. So if you're in the area, please check it out. And then finally, we have Oskal, I don't know how to pronounce it, Oskal in May, which is in Albania. It's an open source event, and I know David Halas has a talk accepted, and we also have a booth a request accepted as well. So we haven't started planning yet, but we'll share more information as we go along. And of course, in May, we also have Red Hat Summit and OpenStack Summit. Maybe I'll share more information in the next sprints. That's all for this sprint, and thank you. Next slide, please.
All right, this is Dan. I'm going to talk about the classic UI and, as usual, show the kind of the breakout of the PRs. Pretty typical, a lot of bugs that we work on and fix, and mainly that's because of all the work that's going on, refactoring and things tends to generate more bugs. But definitely got some work going on in enhancements this sprint. We normally have work on it, but whether or not they actually show up in the UI or their prep work is dependent on whether they get merged or not and how far along they are. So kind of typical. Next slide, please. So I kind of was promising this over the last couple sprint demos, and I decided to show it. And it just turns out that really hasn't changed much. And I think the slide here, or the actual charts here, have probably like a 3% accuracy, plus or minus 3% accuracy. So really hasn't changed much. But I'd like to think that we did get more features in, more work on features this time. Looks like more bugs as well. But also trying to increase the accuracy of the data that I'm using to get these charts. So I'll decide next time if I want to do this kind of comparison. It depends on how much it changes. Next slide. So bug fixes, obviously, these are just some highlights. There were 30-something bugs that were fixed, and you can see a lot of fixes. Some areas of particular interest as the charting areas. A lot more people are looking closer at the new charts that we have, and the new charts actually have a lot more detail in them. So you can, for example, when you turn on and off different items in the legend, the chart can readjust, and so all of the values that are showing need to kind of relate to the highs and lows that are of the items that are left. So there's a lot of dynamic formatting and things that has to happen to the numbers. Otherwise, you end up with numbers that look the same and things like that. So anyway, those complexities in the chart have kind of created some bugs that people have noticed. So kind of cool. We're fixing it up though, and the charts definitely look a lot nicer than the older ones did. Also, some regressions in there. You can see just things that fixing tech debt and refactoring will lose. Uh-oh, lost my screen. Holy smokes. Back up. And I'm done. No. All right. There we go. Okay, we're back to bug fixes. Okay, so that's enough about bugs. Next slide, please. Somebody leaned on the space bar. Technical debt. So a lot of work in mix-ins, and a lot of this work is prep for some of the other bigger technical debt we're trying to solve, which is to get some more responsiveness in the UI. Oh boy, we're just going crazy over here. Next slide. Who's driving? All right. So anyway, I'm trying to push things into mix-ins, drive the code a little bit, deduplicate a lot of things, and we've actually been able to tell, even in some of the newer code that we've been doing, how much easier it is to add new screens and new functionality to the UI. The PRs are getting smaller and easier to review. So that's goodness. A lot of formatting and styling going on. We've got quite a bit of technical debt, but most of it's known in that area. So it's really just a matter of actually executing on it and finding all the places where we need to fix the icons or the fonts or whatever, and clean up the styling. So that's cool. JQ Plot was our old charting provider. That was still in there, so David noticed that and whacked that. That's gone. And ongoing toolbar refactoring, and that project's moving pretty quickly. So we're just going to keep working on that, keep knocking those down. Next slide. There we go. So features. I noticed that Power Operations were added in the middleware server groups. There's a PR out there on that. That was pretty cool. the replication tab got the backlog added to it, so you can kind of see the status. I got a screenshot for that. We've added the control action to run an Ansible playbook. I think Gregg might be covering that later. And then we actually got forward on the embedded Ansible objects, so now you can actually see the credentials, playbooks, repositories all in the UI. Can't create them yet, but you can see anything that was discovered. And we have a demo about the being able to create service catalog items based on Ansible playbooks. So next slide. So these are going to be some screenshots of what I just talked about. So here's the backlog on the replication. So you can kind of see, how well it's doing. The backlogs are growing, then obviously you're not doing so well. Next slide. Credentials list view. So you can see under the automation tab there, in the Ansible section, there's 3 new items there, 3 new menu items. These are all new for this sprint. Credentials, playbooks, and repositories. This one shows the list of credentials. Next slide. We'll show the summary screen, so you can see the details and relationships from the credentials. And I think the next slide might shows any repositories that are using those credentials. Obviously, there's credentials that don't have repositories; those would not have this link. And next slide. So moving on to see all the playbooks that are discovered inside the embedded Ansible, and there they all are. And I think the next slide shows you the details of those. Yep, you can see the summary of them, when they were created, when they were updated, especially, which provider they belong to, what repository they're in. Next slide, get to the repositories. Oh, okay, yep, there you go. So you see the list of repositories. These would be, I think in the initial phase, we're just going to handle Git repositories, Git-based repositories, but eventually probably expand that to other types of source controls. Next slide. Looking at a detail of a repository. See that there's 8 playbooks in this one, which provider it belongs to, other information. And then you're able to click on the playbooks. So next slide would show the playbooks inside that repository. All right, and next slide. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Harpreet. She's going to share her screen and show a demo of the new playbook service catalog item.
Do you see my screen?
See your screen.
Yeah.
Okay. So a new type Ansible playbook was added in the Catalogs Explorer Catalog Items Add screen, and I have a demo for that. I'm going to run that. Yeah. So once a user selects Ansible playbook in the form, user is redirected to a new angularized form that fully consumes REST API to populate and save the data. And on the form, you see all the required fields in red, and add button is disabled until all the required data is provided. And the data on the retirement tab is not required at this point. We have also added live search to some of the dropdowns that are expected to have a lot of values. User can select the type of cloud type to select the credentials of that specific type. And user can provide a new dialog name to create one, or they can select one from the dropdown. You can add or edit or delete the extra variables. Once you add the catalog item, user is redirected to the details screen that was updated to show the playbook Ansible type data that was provided during the add. And we have also added a link to the dialog. So if user can be redirected to the dialog summary screen. And that concludes my demo.
We'll hand it over to Chris K, I guess, once we get the screens back.
Cool, thanks, Dan. So as always, our overall progress for the sprint. So we didn't leave any, pretty much had everything accepted this go around, just a few outstanding things, which generally happens on the last day of the sprint since the nightly build goes out the next day. Next slide, please. Several new features, kind of behind the scenes stuff. We added the create catalog item API. We've reworked the folder structure per the updated tabs. We've removed the admin tab because there was nothing under there. We've added the ability to bulk edit tags, bulk set ownership, bulk retire now, and bulk retire later, and bulk delete. Next slide, please. Again, a couple housekeeping items. We reworked the folder structure to match the tabs that are in the SUI. We've updated our dependencies. We've separated out the current karma test into its own directory, and we've completed all the preparation for our transition to Angular 4, and we'll be starting that soon. Next slide, please. So some of the major features that got done this sprint, we have the Ansible data to the service details page. Next slide, please. We now allow the creation of a snapshot for a VM. Next slide, please. We have lists and deletion of the current snapshots for our VM, and it will also show the current snapshot. Next slide, please. We've added the ability to list orchestration templates in the service UI. Next slide, please. And we've also added the ability to create and edit orchestration templates in the service UI. Next slide, please. And of course, lots and lots of bug fixes there. So next slide. And there's an extra slide there. Next slide. And on to Gregg.
Cool, thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to cover the highlight reel of the past 2 weeks for Ansible Tower, containers, Hawkular, OpenStack, Rev, Amazon, Azure, and the core provider work. So next slide. But first, a graph. Ansible was crowned king the sprint, and Amazon was a distant second. And I think we'll see a lot of that Ansible stuff show up in the Automate update that Gregg is going to talk about. Next slide. So here's a few things about Ansible. Added some embedded Ansible Tower provider models and workers. This was creating all the models and workers for Ansible Tower inside the ManageIQ appliance. There's some new credential modeling, handling some SCM credentials now. And then, as I said, there's going to be tons more in the Automate update. Next slide. From containers, we saw metrics for archived containers, and this really just means that sometimes containers will die before we can get the metrics for them, and they added some logic in there to make sure we're not missing those metrics. From Hawkular, Dan already stole this one, power ups for server groups. And then on OpenStack, they're now using the task queue for various provider options, including things like some VM operations, operations against stacks and key pairs, and setting the maintenance mode. Next slide. All right, from Rev, now allowing the metric database name to be overridden. You could override it before, but it wouldn't actually take hold, and so there was really just a bug fix in the back end for that. Now collecting inventory for S3 objects in Amazon. And in Azure, we disabled metrics and events in unsupported regions. And really what this means is there's some regions in Azure that just don't support metrics and events. They can't process them. So we on our side don't try to collect them. Otherwise, we just get tons of errors in the logs, and that was really ugly. So next slide. On the core providers team, more graph refresh improvements, and Marcel worked on adding providers, like a provider registry. It's kind of like a plug-in lookup, and here's a little handy example of what that would look like from like the Rails console. You can see that you could just ask what providers are installed and it'll list them all out. So that's really cool. Next slide. I think that's over to Gregg M.
Thanks, Gregg. So I realized everybody was pretty much starting with pie charts, so I felt we needed a pie chart. It's it needs some work, but Marion offered to help me improve it for next time.
I was expecting a real pie, though.
I considered it. As everyone would say, kind of most of the enhancement stuff was around the Ansible work, some bug fixes and refactoring. So I did have a backup slide in case this one didn't come out like I wanted to. So I think that's still in the deck. Next slide.
Nice
there it is.
So,
two things I wanted to point out here. They have possible assassinations and assassinations. I think they should be combined. And then the lower left-hand corner, there's one unknown, which I'm also a bit concerned about, but I'm realizing Emperor is a high-risk job, so that's really it. All right, next slide. We'll move on. There we go. Ansible. So you've seen a lot of this stuff is back-end work, supporting what Harpreet showed in her demo. We're creating the Ansible playbooks within, creating the catalog item as well as creating the items in Ansible that we need to run it. We have the create Ansible inventory when running the playbook, so this is kind of a dynamic creation of the inventory we need. We don't assume that all that inventory is known to Ansible at the time that we start the playbook, so we're dynamically going to create and remove those things, and then automate methods that we needed for our service dialogues to be able to show the list of credentials and allow people to override them. And I just wanted to point out a few migrations that we got in last sprint. We're populating them this sprint for information that we want to show on the service screen. So the start-stop time will allow us to show durations for the plays, as well as all the metadata we want about the job. So what credentials were involved, again, the full start and stop, finish time for the jobs, and the playbooks and hosts that were involved in that. So next slide. And then one of the big features we got in was we wanted to be able to support running the playbook services from a control action. So we've added a new action, run Ansible playbook. Basically, you're pointing at an existing service, and when the action fires, it orders that service. So you actually get a service request created. It goes through all its normal processing. The one option you see in the inventory list there is you can select either localhost. Target machine is the target of the event. So if an event's fired for a VM or a host or some inventory object, that's the object that we'd be passing along to the Ansible run. And then you can list host. So it's an open text field of comma separated either IP address or host names that you want to target for that action. And I think that's it for that slide. Next screen. Tina's going to talk a little bit about generic state updates.
Yes, this last sprint we got in the basic retirement for the generic state machines. At this point, the retirement will run the playbook. It'll set the retirement state accordingly, which will prevent multiple invocations of the retirement state machine. It does mark the service as retired and does not remove the service. But we still have some work to do. Next would be coming. The next step, hopefully next sprint, would be to optionally remove service resources. Now, playbooks by themselves we don't get in our inventory the resources, so like the field could write methods that would associate the VMs to the services, and in that case, they could, Kevin, yeah. So that we would ensure that we have the functionality to be able to delete those resources. And hopefully very soon, we would be able to create a request for retirement tracking purposes, which is really, really important because anybody that deals with retirement now knows that when you initiate a retirement or it's scheduled for retirement, the user or the administrator has no idea what's going on. Basically, it kind of goes into nowhere. You'd have to check the log to see if it was successful or not. We did add notifications, so you'd see a notification failure, but there's a lot of noise, so you probably wouldn't see it. So creating a request for the retirement process would make that visible, and you could track that. Next slide, please. Okay, so the generic service state machine. Our lifecycle state machines use different objects for processing. Our provision state machines use provision objects, and our retirement ones use the various objects for the service or VM. Since we're using the generic state machine, it's got to be one-stop shopping, which means we need the same object to be able to act on all these different capacities. So we've introduced the service object to be used for the generic state machine, which is really nice because the service context for provisioning or retirement would still be the same object. We wouldn't have to use a task for one and try to fish around to see what kind of objects we have. So in order to facilitate that, we changed the calls to automate to provide the service object. And all the generic state machine methods have been modified to use the service object for all processing. And next slide, please.
All right, and then to kind of wrap up the enhancements within Automate. So for the sprint, we added a method from the Automate, a method that can be used within an Automate method to create a service provision request. So we have this today for VM provisioning, for creating an automation request. This functionality actually is available in the API calls today. So we kind of looking to match that. Our use case was around really alerting, similar to when we created the control action. Somebody raises an alert, they can fire a management event, and they're running an automate method, which would allow them to order a service to deal with whatever is going on. So this pretty much matches what we did from the API and the other functionality. So that will be useful. The OpenStack team got in the cloud tenant events. So all of these events now fire a provider refresh when they come in. And a long-time feature that's been out there is this multi-select within the dropdowns. The backend got merged. I was hoping the UI would get merged this sprint. I think there's one last thing to clean up, but so that's very close, and I'm really expected to land in this sprint. That's a great feature to get in. And next slide, I think it's over to GT.
Okay. Well, my pie chart is not as entertaining as the last one. In fact, I forgot to put the number of PRs marked, so I think it's around 40. But you can see it's pretty even distribution between enhancements, bugs, and refactoring. Next slide, please. So some of the highlights and enhancements that we did for this sprint. So more work was done with doing for chargeback without seeing you. So I think we're done there. Now it's an option you can select when you create the report, whether to include metrics or not. And this way you can run a chargeback report without any metrics, even if you first stand up environment and just create a provider and then just have resources in there. You can do chargeback for allocated amounts and fixed costs. Also, we've further locked down the tenant admin from being able to elevate roles by only having him allowed to assign a tenant admin or below. And as Dan mentioned, I also have a screenshot for this. We added a backlog to the PG Logic subscription objects, which shows the replication backlog. Some more work on embedded Ansible service. We have the full lifecycle monitoring now, from start to running to stopping for the external Ansible service. Also for central admin, Nick removed a bunch of stuff around configuring, a bunch of unnecessary stuff. So we kind of discovered that it wasn't necessary anymore to pull the V2 key from the lower regions up because we document that you should have the same v2 key across all your regions for central admin anyway. So we removed a bunch of stuff there. You don't have to configure that anymore. You can just use central admin once you configure replication. And we're starting to do some work with IPv6, and Shimon's working on that, starting to make some changes on the appliance console. There are places where we expect IPv4 stuff only, and he made changes for that, as well as other places where you would accept input for IPv6 addresses and IPv4. So that work will continue into the next couple sprints. Also, while I was doing that, there was a pretty ugly regular expression for validating IPv4 addresses that was removed and replaced with a built-in one for Ruby. That was a nice change. Next slide, please. Some of the highlights and bug fixes. So we had an issue with custom attributes and building the list of fields for report for editing a report. We discovered that there are cases where you could have a nil name and that was actually blowing up, so we fixed that. And LJ made a change. Surprised we didn't have to do this a long time ago, but basically we now rescue any exceptions when we try and synchronize workers on the server monitor, so that basically what was happening is when the server starts up, if there was an exception raised in one of the workers, it would prevent the server from starting up. Now we rescue it, log it, and then move on. There was a fix for chargeback rate tier selection. There was a bug where if you had different units, it wasn't matching properly, and Shimon took care of that. Small change in the job model as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. And since we moved the gems pending directory to a gem, we discovered a few issues with pathing, because there's code in the gem that was looking for relative paths, from where it was located before. So a couple fixes that Nick made there, and I think there's a couple open PRs as well for a couple other things. Next slide, please. Okay, on the technical debt side, so we have an initiative to consolidate our job and task models, and then later on some other things that are similar into one thing. So the first step of this was to basically wrap the jobs with a MIQ task, and then update the UI to only reference MIQ tasks. So Yuri's been working on that. We got that one merged in there. And then some more work on expressions, more refactoring, cleanup there. Couple performance improvements that Libor did on chargeback report generation. So some eager loading and some gains by going through SQL instead of pulling back in Rain and looping through it. Some refactoring on the seeding methods that Shimon did. And like I said, more MIQ expression cleanup. Next slide, please. So here's a screenshot of the updated chargeback report editor. So we've added a selection there to, by default, yes, to include capacity and utilization metrics. If you say no, it'll just run for fixed and allocated costing. Next slide, please. And this is literally the same slide that Dan showed. Just blew out the backlog so you could see it. But I also wanted to talk about it a little bit because if you recall with Ruby Rep, we had a similar thing where we showed the backlog, but there the backlog was the number of rows behind in the backlog. This is a much more accurate measure because it's the amount of data that's in the backlog. Rows was really not that accurate because you could have maybe a few rows with a lot of data or many rows with very little data. So this is exactly how far behind replication is. So that's a nice change, thanks to Nick. And I think that's it for the platform side. All right, Alberto.
Hey, Greg, one question on there. On the jobs and tasks, were there any changes to the UI that people would expect?
No, so you shouldn't expect any changes to the UI at this time. So the UI, there were changes made in the UI repo, but the end user wouldn't see any change in the actual display yet.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yep.
Alrighty. Thanks, Greg. So on the API side, we had a couple of enhancements that came in. So first one is by Tim. We're now exposing the revert action on VM resources. It's simply sending the revert action on the specific snapshot subcollection resource. And the standard action responses here, you can see the message and the task that can be queried separately. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have an enhancement from Jillian to expose the authentications as a primary collection. So you see that /API authentications and the standard gets on collection, get on the resources, the post delete action, the HTTP delete action on the resource, and as well as support for the bulk deletes on authentications. Right now, that's currently used for the automation manager credentials. Next slide, please. Okay, so this enhancement, right? So we have a ability now to create service template. So that was done by Jillian, and also calling out Bill Way for all his help in the modeling, reviewing, and modeling side changes. So this was needed for the service UI, and we currently support atomic services. And here's an example post for creating a service template. Of course, there's a lot more gory detail in the config info section, but that's just a high level. So that's it for the rest. Off to Dave Johnson.
Dave, you there?
He is. He's just muted.
That's
Greg, please unmute him.
His screen is his screen shows unmuted, but he's still muted. Hey Pete, you're up.
I can take it. Yeah, I'll take it. So we wanted to give an update on the Ansible testing. Test cases are finished and currently under review. The user story review is in progress. All working features have been approved, and currently testing whatever is available. Embedded backend done, waiting for the UI. External began testing Ansible Tower 3.1, and the automate control services testing is in progress, waiting for more functionality to be added. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have 95 PRs merged this time, which is actually pretty high for us. It's probably one of the most that we've had merged in a 2-week period. You can see that was predominantly fixing tests. We had a massive kind of hackathon over a week period, just going through and fixing as many of the tests as we can for the latest release. There were a number of UI changes that we went through and altered. There were just a number of changes that had happened since we've been refactoring a lot of the code. So a shout out to Yevgen, who tirelessly went through and analyzed all the failures and created cards and kind of really pushed people to go through and fix that. So yeah, you can see there's a lot of that, a lot of enhancements as well, and then going through and adding a few new features and fixing the framework up. Next slide, please. So I think, as we mentioned last time, we are starting to look at working in a little bit of a more agile way, especially for the framework, the core of the framework. Eventually, we'll be splitting the tests away, so the framework will become almost a separate product in itself from our point of view. So we finished our first sprint yesterday. We have improved the running test pass rate to over 90%. And we had a number of optimizations, a load of test fixes, a rewritten events listener. There was a number of navigation navigation steps that were not optimized and were taking a long time, so we've slimmed that down. And we had a problem with Selenium with its keep alive connection, so we've managed to fix that up as well. Next sprint, it will be more modularization efforts, some more optimizations, and hopefully a lot more of the widgetastic conversions, making the UI a lot simpler to interact with our new widgetastic framework. That's all from me.
All right, and that brings to an end the Sprint 55 review. If there are any questions or comments, please speak up. All right. What's that? That's a link over there to the Sprint 54 review, the YouTube video. And the next Sprint 56 is already underway, and we'll have the Sprint demo 2 weeks from today. Thank you, everyone.
All right.